Thank you very much for that introduction, Keith. And on behalf of SQA, welcome to Scotland and to Edinburgh for the Surpass Conference. And perhaps Keith talked about partners being here today and this event being around BTL's customers and partners. Just very briefly, SQA has worked with BTL now for, I think, 12 years ago we signed our first contract. And I suppose the fact that we've had a contract continuously with BTL over that time and that BTL offered us the opportunity to make this keynote and that we accepted probably tells you all you need to know about our relationship with BTL. I will say a bit more about some of the specific work we're doing with BTL later in the presentation. But really what I wanted to cover just over the next 20 minutes is just to give you a sense, a bit of the sense of the context for assessment in Scotland. I think it's critical, perhaps at an event like this, we can get engrossed in the detail of what we're doing, in the technical detail, the different question types, the way we create questions, the nitty-gritty of assessment. But I guess all of us will understand and know the importance of being clear about the purpose that assessment serves in our education systems, in the environments in which we're operating. And really what I was aiming to do is just to give you a bit of an overview of that in Scotland, of our take on where assessment fits within the overall education system, and then particularly how we see digital assessment contributing to our overall ambitions for assessment, and as I say, some of the work we're doing with BTL. But just perhaps to take a step back, I'm conscious some of you live in Scotland, some of you are from elsewhere in the UK, some of you are from further afield, so I just thought perhaps it was helpful just to do a line or two on Scotland in general terms. And I could get carried away here because I'm a geographer by background, so I was tempted to put a map up and start pointing to places, but you'll be relieved that I didn't do that. I think that's one of the workshop sessions, actually, if you want, one of the fringe sessions, perhaps, as we're in Edinburgh. So Scotland, for the avoidance of doubt, is still part of the UK at the moment, despite all the noise around that. We'll not go any further into that one. Around about 10% of the population of the UK in Scotland, so about 5 million people. But on about 32% of the land area, and that is relevant to some of the things I'll say later on. Perhaps drilling into that a bit further, again, those of you that know Scotland well will know that the majority of the population is concentrated in the central belt of Scotland, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and pretty much the area in between. So 3.5 million out of 5 million people in that area. But between Edinburgh and the north of Scotland, the furthest tip is around about 300 miles. It's 400 miles in the other direction from Edinburgh to London. So there's a lot of Scotland which is pretty sparsely populated, and I say that I think that's important in terms of a context for assessment, and perhaps particularly for digital assessment and the contribution it can make. I talked briefly about the relationship between Scotland and the rest of the UK. You'll know there's toing and froing on that over the years, and they're very much toing and froing at the moment. The Scottish Government was established in 1999 with devolved powers over a range of different matters. But actually education has been a devolved matter in Scotland since 1885, as the slide says. So for nearly 150 years, Scotland has had control over its education system and the way that system develops. So the result of that really is that the education system in Scotland, just to be very clear, is different from that elsewhere in the UK. We have a different system and a different setup, different qualifications, different structures, different agencies involved. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm not going into that debate. That's not the point. The point is it's different. So I'd say, and it's evolved in a way that reflects Scotland's particular character, needs, environment, and thinking. And as part of that difference, this on one slide is just about all the key players in the education system in Scotland. There are some that aren't reflected there. So, for example, the General Teaching Council for Scotland is an important player. The teaching unions are important players within the education system, but this lists the majority of them. I think in terms of a system, I'm not going to go through them as I say it in detail, but the important point about this is there are a relatively small number of key players. So that has a number of benefits. The first is that in any big decision, the key players could sit together around one table and discuss and debate and decide the best way forward. It also means there's a relatively short distance between the teacher in the classroom and the policymaker in Scottish Government and the politician in Scottish Government. And that, along with the sort of the consensual nature, the the collaborative nature of the way the education system in Scotland develops means that policy decisions should be informed by a very clear understanding of what's happening in the classroom now, and vice versa. So there should be quite a tight-knit educational community in Scotland, which should lead to good policy making and good policy implementation. Just to touch briefly on the role of my own organisation, the SQA. Within that, we are one of the key national bodies within the education and training system in Scotland. We are the national awarding body established by the Education Scotland Act 1996. And we have a statutory responsibility, so a legal responsibility, to deliver school exams in Scotland. We have about 700 staff, based partly here on the south side of Edinburgh in Dalkeith, and partly through in the city centre in Glasgow. But again, indicating the close-knit nature of the education community. We work with around about 15,000, we call appointees, so teachers, lecturers, trainers, whose main role is in a classroom or in a training environment, but who give a number of days a year to work with SQA to set exam papers, to mark exam papers, to verify assessment decisions in centres. So out of an overall population of 5 million, and clearly a much smaller proportion of teachers, and amongst that 15,000 people is quite a lot of people who work with us on a day-to-day basis, have a real stake in the education system, the way it operates, and the effectiveness of the system. SQA, in addition to running the national exams for schools particularly in Scotland, we also offer qualifications for training providers and that are delivered in colleges and a range of different environments. And one of the facts that makes us distinctive and unusual in the UK, at least, is that we have a pretty broad spectrum of qualifications. So everything from things like Latin right through to fish farming to very practical vocational subjects. And in terms of levels, we offer everything from entry-level qualifications right up to qualifications that count at degree level. So a very broad spectrum of provision in our portfolio. Our core market is Scotland, as you'd expect, but we also offer qualifications and services outside Scotland, elsewhere in the UK, and particularly internationally. We have a very strong strand of international work, which we're continuing to build. And finally, we do combine awarding and accrediting functions with strict controls and governance arrangements to manage any potential conflict of interest between those. I talked about the importance of assessment reflecting the policy drivers in any country and the policy imperatives and helping to support those policy imperatives. And as in any environment, I suppose the policy environment in Scotland is pretty dynamic and perhaps increasingly dynamic, as you can see from this slide. And really this just lists probably the key policies that are influencing the way education and training moves forward at this stage in Scotland. The first one is Curriculum for Excellence, which was launched in 2006. And I'm just going to read a few words from the sort of the description of education of Curriculum for Excellence. And it says, designed to achieve a transformation in education in Scotland by providing a coherent, more flexible and enriched curriculum from 3 to 18. So that's it in a nutshell, really. That was the purpose, that is the purpose of Curriculum for Excellence. And although it was published 10 years ago now, that's the touchstone for all educational policy developments and everything that's happened in education since, and particularly the ethos that was reflected in Curriculum for Excellence. I say that's still very much alive today. One of the other key policy drivers is the Developing Scotland's Young Workforce report published in 2014. And this is very much about ensuring that as many young people as possible achieve positive destinations after compulsory education. So it's in its words, it's fundamentally about ensuring a work-relevant educational experience for our young people. So a key point of developing Scotland's young workforce was about links between employers and the education system and ensuring that young people will receive an experience during their education system which makes them ready to go into employment. The National Improvement Framework, published just earlier this year, the principle behind the National Improvement Framework was around gathering information on the things that we believe are important within our education system so we can judge how well we're doing and where we need to focus our development efforts. So it talks about seeing new and better information gathered throughout primary and early secondary years to support individual children's progress and to identify where improvement is needed. So it's very much about gathering data, information, analysing that data and information, and taking action on the basis of it. The Delivering Equity and Excellence report that was published earlier this summer really is a drawing together of a number of other strands within the system. I counted a couple of weeks ago, and there are 80 deliverable dates within a 26-page document, so it's pretty ambitious and pretty broad-ranging, and I think that's what's keeping Jill back at the office at the moment. It's not all 80 of those, but certainly a number of them. And the Equity and Excellence report, whilst it kind of captured a range of different drivers, it contained 3 key priorities. The first one is closing the attainment gap. The issue that there is in Scotland, as in many other countries, is a persistent gap between the attainment of those learners who come from the areas that are most deprived and those that are least deprived. It's a persistent and significant problem in Scotland, and one the current government is absolutely focused on addressing. Second point was around ensuring a curriculum which delivers for children and for teachers. And the final point, third priority, was empowering teachers, schools, and communities to deliver for children and young people. So again, I talked about the short distance between policymakers, between government and teachers, really reflected in that priority about giving responsibility for teachers to make decisions about the learners that they are responsible for. The last strategy, coincidentally, and perhaps fortuitously in terms of today's event, was just a couple of weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago, I think the government published a digital learning and teaching strategy, the first time we've had a national digital learning and teaching strategy in Scotland. And the document said it set out a comprehensive approach to deliver the increased effective use of digital technology in education. And I think the key words we've certainly taken from that are a comprehensive approach. So again, about all key players working together, recognizing that in digital, as in other areas, no one body can make the changes that are needed, but we need to work together. But also the increased effective use, so not just talking about let's get iPads out into every school, let's get technology out there, know why we're doing it, and be able to evaluate its effectiveness and talk about its effectiveness in, for example, closing the attainment gap. I mentioned the importance of assessment in amongst this, that any assessment we're working with needs to support these policy objectives. And in amongst the documents around Curriculum for Excellence was a strong statement about the importance of assessment. Above all, assessment need to meet learners' needs and enable all learners to achieve aspirational goals and maximise their potential. That applies both to the formative assessment that Scotland did some pioneering work under the Assessments for Learning programme, but also the assessment for our qualifications. So again, that's a key reference point for us in terms of what do we believe assessment is about in Scotland. Again, coming back to SQA's commitment, perhaps trying to tie these things together a bit. This is a statement from our corporate plan, not the most exciting document perhaps, but as a public body we have a corporate plan out there which includes this commitment to develop progressive approaches to qualification development, assessment practice and service delivery. So it doesn't refer to e-assessment particularly or digital approaches to assessment, but it's very clearly embedded in there as part of a wider approach and strategy to use technologies to help us achieve the things that the slide refers to. And again, just think about how we bring these things together and how we develop a coherent vision. I talked about the digital learning and teaching strategy. The strategy contained commitments from a number of different organisations, including from SQA, what we're actually going to do to help achieve our vision for the use of digital in learning and teaching. And this is one of the things that we've committed to in that strategy, is developing over time the capabilities needed to manage all assessment evidence in a digital format manage assessment evidence in a digital format for all of its qualifications. So that's us putting a marker down saying this is our aspiration, this is where we believe we're going to go. We haven't set timescales for this at the moment, but it's a statement of intent which reflects the work we've done so far, some of which I'll come on to talk about. And really the key point around this is that I suspect many organisations are in the same position at the moment. We're in a kind of horrible hybrid of paper and digital approaches, and that's just where we are at the moment. What we're looking to do is to move to a position where we can see the whole process digital from end to end, from the generation of the evidence by the learner to the assessment of that evidence, whether that assessment takes place in a school, in a centre, or by SQA externally, and then to the quality assurance of those assessment judgments. And that if a piece of evidence is generated digitally by a learner, it should never turn into paper at any stage in that process. Those of you that were paying particular attention might recognize this slide from last year, just to show that we're not just kind of making it up as we go along. There is some consistency, as perish the thought, there is some consistency in our approach. And I'd say I think this is a slide, I think David takes the credit for the thinking behind this, but it reflects the fact that in a portfolio as diverse as SQA's, with the range of different assessment approaches we have, there isn't a one-size-fits-all model to digital assessment. And again, it's stating the obvious in an audience like this, but this is SQA's take, and it's still, even though we've had the slide for a year, it's still developing thinking, it's still thinking we're testing out. But essentially, across the top there, those are the different types of evidence that learners generate for our qualifications. So there's evidence for units within our qualifications, which is internally generated and internally assessed. There's evidence for coursework. We still have a lot of coursework in our school qualifications. And then there's the conventional examination assessment evidence. And we see different approaches, different tools, different techniques supporting us in our aspiration to be able to gather and work with evidence digitally across all those different types. Our on-screen assessment, we've been working now with BTL for, I think, 12 years on that, and that's part of our business as usual activity. I'm going to talk a little bit more now about computer-based projects and Surpass Paper Plus. Sorry, Tim, haven't updated that slide. So, let's say we see Surpass Paper Plus and computer-based projects as two developments which have real potential for us in the way we work towards that aspiration of digitizing assessment evidence. Both are still in the early stages with us at the moment. It's very much in proof of concept phase for Surpass Paper Plus, and are undertaking a number of different activities around this. Essentially, for those of you who haven't come across Surpass Paper Plus before, it's a service, it's an app that allows a learner to take an examination, to create their response for an examination using a digital device, a laptop or a tablet, rather than a piece of paper and a pen. It then allows that response to be transmitted, or will allow time, directly into an e-marking system. And the key thing for SQA is that this taps into a trend which we're already seeing in our centres. That trend is that increasing numbers of learners are asking for permission to use a digital device to capture their exam responses anyway, whether those learners have particular assessment requirements or whether they don't. And I think it reflects that point that fewer and fewer of us use pen and paper regularly to write at length. And for younger learners, that's probably even more the case. So we're seeing more and more requests for learners to be able to capture their responses digitally. We need to make sure that when we offer that service, we do so in a way which is robust, scalable, secure, and Paper Plus, we believe, offers us that opportunity. We've done some limited trialing at the moment, just with 4 centres and about 90 learners, and the feedback has been pretty positive. You can imagine mixed views from learners because it's quite a different concept. And to be fair to them, they didn't have a great deal of time to sort of understand how it would work. But from the work we've done, from the limited work we've done, we see some clear benefits around learners being able to take the exam in the format in which they learn. And again, those of you heard Peter Timms talk about the fact that in some schools they work digitally all year, and then 6 weeks before the exam they say, right, put the computers away, get your pen out. And there's a school not far from here which has the same experience with some of our qualifications. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. For centres, and we're working with a small group of centres around this at the moment, the clear benefit they see is the getting away from the paper chase of having to package up, reconcile, deal with all the paper around the exam system. And for us, clearly that's a big benefit as well. But as I mentioned, the key benefit for us in terms of our operational processes is the ability to get the digital response from the machine where the learner creates it straight into our e-marking system. And that is something that BTL, our e-marking partner, are working on at the moment. It is critical for us in terms of the way we take our decision to take Surpass Paper Plus first, because that's where many of the benefits come. And I'm sure I don't need to elaborate on that point for any of you that are involved in supporting scanning of scripts. It's not something that anybody would continue to do for any longer than they have to. Just finally, touch on computer-based projects. And going back to that slide, this is whereas Paper Plus, Surpass Paper Plus, is designed to support fixed point assessments, exam type assessments, computer-based projects, supports a much more kind of continuous assessment approach, a coursework assessment approach of the sort that's reflected in many of our qualifications. Essentially, again, I think people in the room who are more familiar with this than me, I'm sure, but it allows learners to create evidence digitally using native applications on their desktop, using Word, PowerPoint, Excel, whatever they might be using, but then to capture that evidence rather than printing it out and sending it to SQA, as is the practice at the moment. It allows them to capture that evidence digitally in a specific question type and to go back in and out of that question type over a period of time, continually adding evidence or replacing some evidence with new evidence as they do some additional work. The evidence is then submitted directly to, in this case, SQA, through the computer-based project, and again can be moved directly into our e-marking system. Again, just listed some of the benefits of this approach. Again, the fact of being able to take out so much paper from the system is a critical benefit, but also the ability to e-mark material that isn't e-marked at the moment and get the quality assurance benefits of that is a key driver for us. Again, as with Surpass Paper Plus, we're trialing this in a number of centres at the moment, and the feedback is very positive. But as I say, we see this as a key way of achieving our objective of digitising all assessment evidence. So just in conclusion, as I've illustrated, Scotland's education system has evolved in a very distinct way over nearly 150 years to meet the particular needs of Scotland. The challenges we face aren't unusual. Education systems across the world face similar systems. Our context and our response will be distinctive and different, as I said, as the education system has been over the past while. The policy environment will continue to be dynamic and increasingly demanding, I think, has come under increasing scrutiny from government, from other stakeholders, and that's absolutely right that all of our activities should be scrutinised. We should understand what it is we're trying to achieve and how successful we're being in that. Across the education training system, education assessment has an absolutely key part to play. It seems to us that the use of digital approaches to assessment, and this is part of what we're trying to do, is to reflect the benefits of digital approaches to assessment across all of those policy areas, so it's not seen as something separate and distinct. Digital is seen as something that can help contribute to the achievement of all of those other policy aspirations in the documents I referred to earlier on. And my last point really is that I firmly believe we need to be bold and visionary in how we think about digital assessment, that there are significant challenges that all of us in this room will be familiar with and aware of. But unless we are bold, unless we're willing to challenge some of the sacred cows and some of the established ways of doing things, we won't achieve the progress that we need to provide an assessment system that supports the needs of future learners, not of learners today. And this captures it for me. This point was made in the context of the future of higher education rather than assessment generally, but it seems to me that it has validity to use an assessment term in the context of our work as well, and it's an important reference point. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you've learned something from that, picking up Keith's point that you go away slightly wiser for that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks very much indeed.